Hello, and in this video we will build the contact um, class or the contact data model, which is a class that represents the contact concept as we explained in video number 1. If you have not seen video number 1, please go back there to review what each component of the app we are building. And here we're setting up the app and creating the contact class. So first you open Xcode and create, and here I'm using Xcode 5. So if you're using a different version, it may look different, but it should. What we're doing here is very simple, so it does not really impact. It's not impacted by any difference in the different versions. So create a new project. Let me resize things here. So we're in iOS application, and we're gonna go with a single view application. To ask what's the name, and we'll use your last name and then the project name. We don't need a class prefix here, and the device is an iPhone. And click next. Then you save this project to your folders and click create. You can specify the configuration of the project. If you want to upload any images, you can do that, and you are ready to you can set which iPhone you want to run this app on, the 3.5 or the 4-inch. And as a result, you need to adjust your storyboard based on which one you're going to use. We are gonna handle the storyboard in a different video, in the fourth video, but in this one we're going to create a class. The app already comes with two classes, one that represents the app called app delegate, and one that represents the single view. The storyboard comes with a single view because we use the template that says single view app. So every view comes with its own class and it's already connected to it, and so on. So we have one class, two classes, then we need to create our own class that represents the contact. So to create a class, you can go to File, click New, or you can right click on the app name and say New File. We have done this before when we created a view controller. This time we're creating a class but not as a view controller. So here is Objective-C class. And then you give the class a name and you specify which subclass of it should be. Since we are creating a class that is not a sub of any of the library classes, it will be a sub of this NS object. NS object is a root class. It has very simple feature that every object in Objective-C or in the language should have, and our class will be like that. So we're gonna call this contact. So this is a class that represents the concept of a contact and that will have the properties and or attributes and behavior or functionality of a contact. You specify where you're gonna save this. And now we have the contact class. In Objective-C, every class is represented by two files. One file is a header that you have to import and include in any other class that uses this one, and an implementation where you implement the different behavior. In the header, you define all the attributes and all the properties that and all the behaviors or modules that other classes may use, and in the implementation you can still define stuff in the implementation, but anything you define in the implementation will be hidden from what other classes will need or use. So what do we need in the contact? As we mentioned in the previous video, in the contact we are using first name, last name, and email. These are the three things that represent a contact. And maybe we can add something here in the documentation that says what this class is about, represents the concept of a contact in the address book. You can add more details here if you want to make it clear to yourself. So every class is two parts. One part is the attributes, which are made out of or represented through properties or instance variables. The instance variables are the ones where we use the curly braces. The part 2 represent the behavior of the contact, and this is created by the methods or modules, methods or messages. So what attributes we want to create, and how do we want them? Do we want them instance variables, or do we want them as properties? The difference between the two is on how the Objective-C, how much do you want to use built-in Objective-C feature. In a property, Objective-C already creates two methods for you, a method to retrieve the property and a method to change the property. In an instance variable, it doesn't do that for you. So if you want these methods, you have to create them yourself, or usually you use an instance variable if you don't think that you will need anyone outside this class to use them. But you include those instance variables because you want them to have the scope of the entire class. So the first name and last name and email are actually going to be used throughout our app, so they should be properties. So to create a property, you start by adding a property. Oh, I am in the implementation. I need to be in the header file. I'm in the wrong file here, sorry. Yep, I need to be in the interface, not the implementation. So property, and then you need to give the property some attributes that describes how you want this property to behave in memory, or how you want this to be created in memory. This is beyond the scope of the class, but it is good knowledge for you to learn about these things are. And the type of the property, which is NS string, and then the name of the property, and we have first name. And then we want to create another one. We're going to give them the same attributes, and NS string, and this is last name. And then a third property again has the same attributes, and this will be email. You can have as many as you want. I'm only going to stop at these three, but feel free to expand, add an image if you want, add a phone number if you want. This all will be good. In the behavior, we have every time you create a class of your own, there is a behavior you need to include, which is a behavior to initialize that class. So we need to add a method. To define a method, you start by defining, should the method be accessed through an instance of this class, or can you use a class name? For instance, when I use NSString, I can use a string with format. I can send the message string with format to an NSString, or the message standard user default to the NS user default. Any message that you want to send to the class name, you add a plus here. However, if you think about NSString is equal to, you can't send is equal to the NSString class. It needs an object. It needs an instance of the class. So you have to initialize a string first. Then that string, that initialized string, what we call instance, that's the one you send is equal to. So if your method is going to an instance, then you use a dash. In our case, initializing this will go to an instance, and we can return, it will return a contact, and we can use a generic ID here since contact is not yet created, and ID is a generic type of what value will be returned. Then you give the method name in it. Then you see, is this method going to have arguments? Meaning, Do you want to initialize with default data, or do you want the user to give you the initial data? If you want the user to give you initial data, the method or the message need to have arguments to receive that initial data. In our case, we want the user to give us initial data. So we want to set up the initial method to receive that initial data. What initial data we want? We need data for each one of those, because I want to initialize the contact by assigning data to each one of those variables. So I can say initialize with first name to indicate that my first data is a first name. Use a column, parentheses to put the type of the data, which should be exactly the same as the type of the property that this data will be assigned to. Give it a temporary name. This could be any name, and I'm calling it here temporarily first name. Then you use a space, and you specify part of the name. So you said init was first name, and then we will say you can put anything as part of the name of the method. So I say last name, and again the last name will be an n string type, and the name of this argument temporarily last name, then a space, and then you put an email as the part of the name of the method to indicate that I want to receive something for the email, and you specify the type of what you want to receive, and then the name that you're going to receive it in, and then a semicolon. This might take you some time to get a grasp of. The name of the method is this. Init was first name, last name, email. This is a very explicit name, a long name of a message. The name of the message is init was first name, last name, email. That is the name. Then the message received 3 arguments. An argument that will be called temporary first name, an argument that will be called temporary last name, an argument that will be called temporary email. Each argument has a type. It just happened that all of them are NS string. The reason it is broken down like this is that Objective-C thinks that it is easier to break down the variables or the arguments within the part of the name that represent that variable. So you say init was first name, and split the name from first name to last name, the name of the message, and insert the argument that relate to that, and so on and so forth. Since we are building the header file, all what we want to do is to define that there will be an instance message or instance method that has this name and these arguments, and we conclude with a semicolon to indicate that we are not providing the body of that message. We're not providing the body of that message. So that's the header file of contact. So let's move on to the implementation. And if you want to see the header file as we write, you can click on the assistance editor, which will give you the header file on the side here, and you can adjust these as you want. In the implementation, as you know, the first thing we do is to synthesize those properties. To synthesize and say first name, comma, last name, comma, email. Then you want to implement that method that we have. So if you type init and start typing the name of the method, it will recognize that you have a name of the method in the header file, and it gives you the full name as you can see it here. So don't retype that stuff again, just hit enter, and it types the exact what we call the method header or the method name, and it type it here. You can't add a semicolon, because if you add a semicolon, it means you're no longer going to implement it, or you define it, but we already defined it. So what you need to here is to define the body of the method by adding the open curly brace and the close curly brace. So now you have the body of the method. Now this method's job is to initialize our contact and return the new contact that is initialized. So how do we do that? First step is to initialize the super class. What is the superclass? Look at the header file. We say our class name is contact, and this contact is a subset or subclass of NSObject. NSObject is our superclass. Every time you create your own class, you must have a superclass. This is what connects what you have done with the library. So you initialize that superclass in the first step. So if you remember the keyword self, which refers to the current object of this class, so this is what we're initializing. We're trying to initialize the self here. So we're saying initialize the self by going to the super, which will be the NSObject instance, and say initialize. Super has also an init method. So you go and say initialize whatever you want to initialize that we don't know about, because this is the library. So we're extending the library and we're saying the library, you need to do your own things, go initialize what you need to initialize, and now we're ready to do our own initialization at that time. So we come here and say if, and we'll use this if to make sure that we have something. If the initialize of the super is correct, then the self will be true. There will be something in self. Otherwise, self will not be true. So I can say else, then there isn't initialization. So this means that super initialized correctly, and now we have an object in self. The else means that something wrong happened and no object is created in self. So if we correctly initialize self, what I want to do is to assign these arguments, the value that whoever wants to initialize the contact sent to me, I want to assign them to those properties. So I can write the property directly, and I can say assign the value from temporary first name to the property first name. I can also do that by sending a message to self and say set last name. See, we did not create set last name. How was it created? It was created by the synthesize. So that's what synthesize does for the different properties. It creates those set and get method to help you retrieve and change the value, and it gives it an argument. So I can say temp last name. So I can use this by directly setting the value of the property, or I can use this by calling the other method. There are advantage and disadvantage to each. In the initialization, this is preferred. In any other method, this is preferred. Alright, so with the email, we can do any one we want. So I'll use the temp email. So I initialized each one of the methods. Initialize each property with the values received through the arguments. And then now that I created an assigned value, initialize the properties, I have a self object that I can now return to whoever wants a contact. So return the new contact object instance or object to whoever sent the init message. So how about else? Something wrong. So what should we do if something wrong? Return nil. Return nil meaning that no object is created, and whoever is using it is wanting a contact object should find what's wrong. I wrote a lot of comments here which made it look too much, but if you take my comments out, or maybe if I expand this a little bit, we initialize the self, initialize self through super, check if super is correct, did initialize correct. If so, I want to set my 3 properties to the values received through the arguments. If that is not true, return nil. In this particular class we're creating, there's only one behavior, which is initialize the class. I don't have any other behavior, so that's all what I needed to do. So that's all for this video. We created our first part of the model, which is the contact class, to represent all the data that we want to hold in a contact. In the next video, we will continue with the model and create the contact controller or the data controller, which will have an array of contacts and additional behavior.